Hi there, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter. Right now, I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Jennifer Armstrong, the author of Seinfeldia, How a Show About Nothing Changed Everything. She's written 8 books. She's also a pop culture historian and a writing coach. Thanks so much for being here, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. This is going to be a show about something. Or is it nothing? Seinfeld, the show, not the person, is always on my mind, at least. A day doesn't go by, or maybe an hour doesn't go by, where I don't encounter something that makes me think of a Seinfeld line. Just some examples. While shopping for medicine, this is tough acting, but this is long lasting. While eating chips, just take one dip and end it. While driving in my car, waving to someone else, yes, go ahead, get in, get in. Or how about wondering if the dry cleaner is wearing your clothes? Is it stealing to take something back that you loaned someone? Or are you allowed to go to the same place an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend goes to? Is that based on who broke up with who? Did people think these things before Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, Jennifer?
I think they probably did in some way, but I believe strongly that the lasting appeal of Seinfeld is really that they gave us a way to think about these things and they gave us a way to express that. So they were things that were always bugging everyone, but we didn't have clever ways of saying it, and we didn't know how to necessarily say it to other people. You know, it almost felt like, well, isn't this too stupid to even express to other people necessarily? And they said, no, it's not. These are the actual things that make up most of life, right? I mean, not to get too deep too fast, but it really is true that, you know, they're like, they say it's the show about nothing, and they have resisted their own label at times in that regard, but it's a show about everything in another way. Like, I think it's a show about how your life actually is just made of all of these little tiny moments, many of which can be kind of annoying and kind of funny. And really, you know, life isn't about these big dramatic moments for the most part, the way that other TV shows would make you think. Everything isn't a Grey's Anatomy episode, but everything is kind of a Seinfeld episode.
Jerry Seinfeld describes that, I think it's on the DVDs of the shows. Jerry Seinfeld says, we exposed the gaps in society. Is that a way that you put it?
I love that way. I mean, he's so smart. They're so smart, him and Larry David. And that's the thing, is that the show actually is kind of philosophical. You know, I think that's like I said, if you just count the big moments that would make it onto most TV shows, most of us wouldn't even have a TV show. But sometimes, like, you can feel that your day is kind of going like a sitcom, and they were able to kind of pick out these little teeny moments, and then, like I said, give them, you know, they're hilarious writers, so they were able to give us these funny little phrases to refer to things that no one had referred to before, like shrinkage, or, you know, real and spectacular, or, you know, any of these things that, like, you wouldn't necessarily have wanted to talk about in polite company before, but they made it kind of okay because they made it just, isn't this funny, as opposed to some taboo.
It's so funny because I was thinking about all the different things that really didn't get much airtime on network TV for a long time. And the 2 things you just mentioned are things that I didn't even think of, but I still thought of like 5 or 6. We're going to get to them in a minute. But your book is titled Seinfeldia, and that's a place, you say. You say that Seinfeld has generated a special dimension of existence somewhere between the show and real life. Did they start out trying to do that? And then what is Seinfeldia?
I don't think they started out trying to do that. And to be honest, like, I don't think they started out trying to do anything or much, I should say. And that's true of a lot of TV shows or even pop cultural phenomena in general. It's like, people make so many TV shows in the world. Most of them don't even get on the air. If they do, they don't last. And as we know from Seinfeld's backstory, you know, it barely kind of crawled through the first few seasons before it became a hit. So, you know, I don't think they were thinking that big before. They were thinking, like, can we make something that's funny? I really think those guys in particular are that was always their main goal. And they certainly met and exceeded that.
So where is Seinfeldia?
Well, I think that this is something like we said, that they didn't necessarily mean to do, but it was so good. It started, the bridge between real life and this show that we were just talking about, because it is in your everyday ether if you love the show, that it just started to interact with real life. And this went in particular for, as they started to bring in characters who were inspired by real life people. We have everyone from Kenny Kramer, who inspired Cosmo Kramer from day one. He was, Larry David's across the hall neighbor who he had a very similar relationship with and based him on that. And then, all the way through to the soup Nazi, who is based, I think we all know, on a soup place in Manhattan. And, the guy who played the soup Nazi, Larry Thomas, ends up spending the next 20, 30, we could keep going, years playing this one character at events and things because people love it so much. All of these different ways that the show has interacted with real life, both these big fictional characters and just the everyday phrases like we were talking about, makes it so that it's almost like there's this own little world for Seinfeld fans, and there are a lot of Seinfeld fans. And I always say, like, Seinfeld fans have their own special language. You mentioned, making these references every day and throwing them out. I think part of why we love that, besides just being able to refer to these things that we notice in daily life and want to comment on with these Seinfeldian terms, it also allows you, like, I always think of kind of like throwing out a little, like, if you see that another person gets it when you make the reference, right, you kind of know, you're like, oh, that's one of my people. And I think,
totally do that.
Right. And it's like, fine if they don't, like, you're not judging them if they don't, especially if they're younger or whatever. But if you see the other person light up right away, you're like, oh, this is like a person who not only gets the show, which is great, but I think this kind of humor is so special to people that you assume something even more. You assume a deeper connection the minute somebody outs themselves as a fellow Seinfeld fan, because you're like, oh, they're like a smart, funny person who gets it.
Right. We're all living in the same plane of existence.
Yeah.
You said that you didn't think that they started out trying to do anything, but where did they get this idea from, Jerry and Larry? And talk about this trip to the grocery store that you outline in the book.
Yeah. I mean, obviously they're trying to do something, or else they wouldn't bother at all, right? But I think that with most big artistic ventures like this, like, you have to start out just with the basic idea and kind of build from there and see where it goes. But they basically, what happened was Jerry had been approached by NBC because he was a pretty successful stand-up comedian. And someone asked him if he wanted to do a show, which was pretty standard operating procedure, especially at that time, but even still today, probably. And he didn't have any ideas, but he was like, I'll take the meeting because I'm not an idiot. And took the meeting, and then kind of was like, okay, now I have to figure out if I have any ideas. And he approached Larry David, his fellow stand-up comedian, who he really liked and liked his sensibility, and also knew that Larry had written for this show called Fridays, which was basically a Saturday Night Live ripoff that was running for a while. And he basically thought, well, at least this guy's written for TV before. He might have some ideas. And they were walking through a Korean deli in New York City and kind of just riffing on stuff. You can totally, I feel like you can, just knowing those two as well as we know them now, it's like you can imagine the banter that goes on when they're walking through anything. They're kind of commenting on everything. And Larry said, this is something you don't see on TV, a show that's just two guys talking. And what I always like to add as a caveat to wannabe TV writers out there is true. And it was really successful that they started with this idea and built on it. But it can't just be any two guys talking, I don't think. These two guys talking in particular turns out to be something.
What's amazing is that the exact situation you're talking about of Larry and Jerry talking starts, or it becomes an entire season of Seinfeld. And so now they're living on the show in what was once only in reality, and then started to bleed into the show and actually became the show. So Seinfeldia also has like a TV counterpart, which is also what we see Larry doing with Curb.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
This is exactly it. I think that's part of what struck me, is the ways that it keeps like going back and forth between the TV world and reality, and it's constantly interacting with it and then builds into something else. It's almost like it hasn't stopped yet, right? Because we probably will get more Curb, and we've gotten Curb pretty recently. So the fact that then, yes, Larry goes on to get this show, Curb Your Enthusiasm, because he's the guy who made Seinfeld. It's specifically that, and it is him playing himself, the guy who created Seinfeld. They end up having that great reunion season on Curb for Seinfeld.
Phenomenal, right?
It's really,
they have the set and everything. Yeah,
it's really one of
incredible.
my favorite like things that has happened in pop culture, period. It was the only way they could ever do it. They would never do just like a cheesy, I don't think, who knows, I don't think I could see them doing a straightforward kind of reunion special or anything like that. So this was just perfect for them. And then it just allows this interaction to go on endlessly. And I would say even something like, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, Jerry's show now has had, he's had Michael Richards on, he's had all of them on, and we got to see, in some ways full circle. It was basically an episode where it was Larry and Jerry talking for the duration of an episode. And it was exactly what had inspired Seinfeld to begin with. And you could see that I remember that they were riffing on like pancakes and like Larry's eating habits and all of this stuff. And you understand then when you see them, why this could make at least the basis of a show. I think eventually it obviously grows into something more than just Jerry and George talking.
So how do they invent the characters? And then how did they cast them? And then the obvious question is, which came first, the actor or the character? Are we watching Jason Alexander, or are we watching George, or are we watching Larry? And how do we all tie this all together? Who are these people?
That's another thing. That's another thing that I think makes the Seinfeldian-ness of it. I think it's, it's just occurring to me right now, in fact, that I think it's part of this whole thing is just their actual willingness to interact with real life, essentially. And it was, now everybody has, we've had a million shows since that's like a comedian playing a terrible version of himself or whatever. But that wasn't done then as much. It was more like a comedian would get a show and then he'd play like a family guy, who makes some of his jokes from his stand-up routines. But this was really supposed to be a version of Jerry, but obviously in an alternate dimension, a fictional dimension. But this was Jerry the comedian, Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian, living his life with these fictional friends. And so, a lot of it came from real life inspirations. They were not afraid of that. And in fact, Larry embraced it. Larry often required it from his writers when they were pitching later. He wanted to hear things that had really happened to them in real life that were funny and that they could use. So he started out with that rule for himself to begin with. And so, yes, I think it's clear, even though it seems like they didn't make it super clear right away, that George is based on Larry David,
But the odd thing is, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the odd thing is that then in Curb, Larry is then resentful of when people say you were the idiot on Seinfeld, but he couldn't be. He really couldn't be, because he wrote it that way.
Right. I know. It's
So odd.
They're very cranky too, is the other thing. You just have to
Right.
know that, because one of the other things they hate is when people say it's the show about nothing and they're the ones who wrote that. So like, don't know what to tell
Well,
you.
what do you mean nothing?
But
Sorry, go ahead. So then Julia Louis and
yeah.
go ahead.
So Larry, I mean, I remember like Jason Alexander's talked about, for instance, that they didn't tell him that this was Larry. And so when he first went in to audition, or he did it on tape, but he blatantly did like a Woody Allen thing, because that was how the show sort of struck him. And I think that's right. And it's very funny to watch the early episodes, because you could really see him doing Woody Allen in those episodes. It's very funny. And then a couple episodes in, I think I could be getting this wrong, and I feel like it's in the book, but it's something like maybe the episode where he quits and then goes back to work afterwards.
And he poisons his boss. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that Larry had done, and that Jason basically questioned something like that, where he said, who would do this? Why would this happen? And Larry said, well, it happened to me. And that's when Jason realized, oh, I should start doing
I'm playing
here.
Larry, right?
Yeah. And then I do think he turns into his own special thing as the show goes on, because that is a character who really just, I mean, they kind of put him through it. You know what I mean? Like, they just make him more and more sort of pathetic and miserable at times when they start having him live with his parents and all
at the beginning of the show, he was a real estate agent, and he was employed. He was gainfully employed. George
he was sort of. I always say, especially the pilot is funny to watch because it's really off from the rest of the show.
Yeah.
My favorite fact about the pilot is that George gives Jerry girl advice, and you're like, no, that's not how this is going to ultimately go at all. Jerry does not have girlfriend problems later at all that he needs George's help with. So we've got, like, they start out with these connections, I think, to real life figures. Same goes for, as we mentioned, Kramer, who is really based on a guy named Kenny Kramer. They even paid him a little bit for his last name.
And so I want to ask you about Kramer real quick, because when you watch the DVDs and the behind the scenes stuff, you get the feeling that you really sort of know Jerry Seinfeld and Julia Louis and you sort of know Jason Alexander just from watching them act so much and the way they play their characters. You sort of get the sense that they're kind of bleeding into one another.
Right.
But when you watch Michael Richards play Kramer and you see the outtakes and you see the interviews that they do with him, he is so deadly serious.
He is.
He's a completely different person than the character. And so I don't know that I have an actual question about this. I'm just making an observation. It's a funny observation, I guess, that Michael Richards is just much more of a precise, and I don't want to say artful because they're all artful, but he's much more of a precise and sort of cerebral presence as he's acting. He's
a real, I feel like in some ways, this isn't exactly true, but it happens on a lot of shows. I feel like every great sitcom ends up with like the one method actor who they're all like, okay,
he never laughs in the outtakes or anything.
He hated when people broke. That was one of the big things. It's like he's one of the funniest people alive, and he hated when people would laugh in the scene and wreck it, and he'd have to do it over again. And he'd be just off in the corner, kind of like studying his script, or like he liked to wear Kramer's shoes to get into character. He liked to stay in character. There's often one very serious, kind of difficult person on a set. It's like part of the whole thing. I mean, I think it's great. It seemed like he was not so much to handle that they couldn't handle it. And also it does seem like, honestly, the rest of them, from my perspective and from what I've heard, sound like such like pleasant people to work with in general. I think Jerry can be cranky even in his public persona, but it seems like he was really like pretty good to work for and with, especially with his fellow actors. And Julia and Jason just strike me as like two of the nicest people ever in Hollywood, which is a very funny thing given who they were playing. But I think that the rest of them were pretty laid back about it and could handle it. And you have to admit that his results, at least, were spectacular. So, and that was a different kind of character though. Like you said, it does feel like there are elements of the others in them, in their characters. Whereas like Kramer himself is more of a cartoon, like
Yeah.
Kramer, I mean, I love him and I love him as a character, but I don't think you feel like you got to like his inner soul. Not that the other two were exactly exposing their inner soul, but I don't know. There was stuff that was a little more human that bled through, I think, for them.
The rule that they come up with early on, Jerry and Larry, is so different than the way sitcoms were going at that time. I think of Full House because that was about the age, but Saved by the Bell and Family Matters and all these other shows, they end up with a lesson and a hug. And Jerry describes it as you had to watch these shows and take something away from you when you turn the TV off, that you learn something about yourself. But the rule that Jerry and Larry came up with went completely against where pop culture was at that time, which was no learning and no hugging.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it might even be more interesting to think of the shows that were great at the time that were also really popular, but still very different, like Golden Girls or Cheers. Like those were on around, I mean, Cheers sort of predates it a little and this comes after, but like those are both shows that are great and totally rewatchable. And we acknowledge their genius, but they still would never, like, they're still so different from, or then later, like it, Friends comes in and becomes like the sort of, they have kind of a sibling rivalry with Seinfeld. And that show is literally, it could just be called hugging and learning to a lot, maybe not so much learning, but lots of hugging and sex. Like there's lots of feeling on that. That show is just pure feeling all the time. And this is a show that just said like, nope, it's not what we're doing. And it, again, I think also adds to that sort of like philosophical feeling that Seinfeld has that very few other shows, especially at that, network sitcoms would have. I mean, they were basically doing like Beckett, for television, to some extent. I feel like there are shades of Beckett and Sartre in there, and really stripping it down and saying like, our main thing is to be funny. And that is it.
How did a Seinfeld production happen? What was the process that they went through? And where did this production fit into the way TV had been done at that time?
They did a number of things quite different. And I feel like so much of it just evolved, which I love. I think it's so interesting to see something have enough time to evolve in front of us. And they really felt their way towards some of this. One of the big things that struck me when I was doing my research that I found incredibly interesting was the writing process, which is that as the show went on, Larry couldn't, at first he was literally basically writing all the episodes, and then realized he was going to have a staff or he was going to really break down soon. So they would go through this process where they'd hire a bunch of mostly guys each season, often turn over most of them. Like a few stuck around, Pete Melman and a couple others, Larry Charles, stuck around multiple seasons because they really nailed the sensibility of the show. But most of them were sort of brought in. They were often stand-up comedians. They would be brought in to essentially like mine their real lives for storylines and bring in pitches. And they worked really independently, which is unusual still to this day. Most shows have writers' rooms where everybody throws stuff out and then like riffs together and then comes up with stories together. And then finally it might be sent off with one writer to finish the actual script. But it's often very collaborative. This was like, you had to pitch, you as an individual writer had to basically find Larry and Jerry in the hallway, which is terrifying in itself, and just pitch them stories. And you'd have to get 4 stories approved. You'd get 1 for each character before you could go off and then write a script. And then you would go off and write a script by yourself. So this was a very sink or swim atmosphere. Some people really, it did not thrive. A couple did. And either way, you had a Seinfeld credit on your resume, and that was great. But the 4 stories in itself, even that was pretty unusual. Like most shows, like the ones we were just talking about, would have what they'd call an A story and a B story. The main story, and then there was like a funny little thing that was going on the side for some other character underneath to keep it going. This had 4 stories in 22 minutes.
And they were equal.
And they were pretty equal. And then the other big thing that evolved that Larry just stumbled upon while writing a script once and loved it so much that he kept it and made it a rule, and it became a hallmark, which was that the 4 stories weren't necessarily at all related upon first, glance. When you'd first hear them, it was just these 4 random funny things that a writer had pitched. And then the big thing was to try to take those 4 unrelated things and bring them together as much as possible by the end in a surprising way. And so like one of my favorite examples of this was The Marine Biologist, where
the best episode. But
I'm
going to give my top 5 later. But go ahead.
It's my favorite too. And this is partly why, is because at the end, this is a great example of putting 2 totally unrelated things together. If people don't remember, George has pretended to be a marine biologist to impress a date. Thought he wouldn't get called on it, but of course they go on a walk on the beach and someone calls for a marine biologist, and he either has to come clean or go save the whale, which of course he's George. So instead of telling the truth, tries to go save the whale. He in fact succeeds and pulls a golf ball from the blowhole or whatever, I don't know what we call that. And it turns out to be, we know immediately when we hear this that that's going to tie in with the fact that Kramer has been shooting golf balls off like the coast of New York into the water. And he says, is that a Titleist? And we already know that it is, and that was the kind of golf ball he was using. So that to me is a perfect example. You didn't know, like while George is giving this great speech at the end about how he saved the whale, you've forgotten about everything else because it's so good and funny. And then they throw the golf ball at you and it's just like this great surprise. And they would do this a lot. And it was part of the sort of ballet that they ended up choreographing every week on the show.
The show starts to take on really edgy things. Just for a few, but you remembered others that I didn't. The contest, the sponge, not that there's anything wrong with it, abortion, faking it, casual sex. At what point does the network back off and say, okay, you can just do what you want? And where was TV at this point, and how did they get away with all of this?
I think that the contest is when like everything came together for the first time on this front. Because hilariously, like something like the Chinese restaurant came before it, which is not edgy in the sense that you're talking about. Just plot wise, it basically had no plot except they wait for a table at a Chinese restaurant and don't get in. And the network pushed back on that one. And it was only because Larry insisted and basically said he'd quit that they got that on, and turned out to be a huge success, at least critically. Critics loved it and got people talking. And so the contest was the next level of that. The contest was not that long into the show. And it really, I think, has been recognized as like the first big water cooler moment for it. But they were already doing well enough that they wrote this episode about essentially a masturbation contest, trying to not masturbate as long as possible. And they kind of figured, and they were often playing a game with themselves. And a lot of people actually in television would do this, where they kind of like, let's see what they say about this one, you know? And they were surprised when the censors didn't say anything. And they were like, okay, I guess we're making.
But they did it without saying it. They didn't.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the whole key,
right.
Is that even when I always, you know, when I'm talking about it and want to remind people like this is the masturbation contest episode, like it's inherently unfunny to the minute you say it out loud, it's already less funny the minute you explain the episode. I think the entire reason it's funny is that they never say it, and all these different ways they come up with of saying, you know, Queen of the Castle, Lord of the Manor, all of that stuff that they master of my domain is first, obviously, and then they do all these riffs and variations on it. And it's not just that, there's also the other stuff they do in that episode where like whoever is out of the contest like is shown sleeping well that night. and the others, and like the way that Jerry and George by the end are just like fighting with each other because they're still in the contest. All of that stuff, it's like, if you're too young to know what it is, you have no idea what this episode's about. You just don't know. Because everything is just like, the clearest they get is the beginning when he says like, he had a Glamour magazine and it was at his mother's, you know, all of that.
One thing led to another.
One thing led to another. And that's it. Like, that's all we get. Hilariously enough, I have since run into someone who worked at Glamour at that time. It was a very big deal for them too.
Really?
They talked about it the next day.
Like Jay Peterman when they got the drop too on that.
Exactly. But that was the brilliance of that episode, was that they weren't saying anything. And to me, I don't want to sound like a prude because I'm definitely not one, but like there is a little bit of a beauty to network television in this way, the way it has parameters and I think it forces some of the best creative moments at times, when we might never have an episode like The Contest if it weren't on network television. And like I said, if you had done the same episode on cable and said whatever you wanted, I kind of think it'd be gross. I don't know. Like, that's just me.
They would have gone too far and lost
I don't want to hear about that then. It's
Right.
only funny because they can't say it. And honestly, a huge, to me, choice, and I can't prove or disprove whether this made or broke the episode, but their decision to include Elaine in the contest, which they debated behind the scenes, and I like that they kind of have the conversation on screen and they give her what do you call that?
Oh, odds.
Yes.
Yeah,
odds.
Odds. Right.
Yeah, like that.
Kramer goes, no, 1,000. Right.
And also, I'm just going to argue right now, she had the best of the four plot lines on that. The JFK Jr. is like brilliant. Like, it's so, and she's always good, but I think of this performance, like where she's almost like hanging off of the desk when she learns at the gym, when she learns that JFK Jr. is in her class and he asked about her. And the way we never see him, and the way that ends up tying into the Virgin stuff with Jerry is just like, this is a great, I actually say that Marine Biologist is my favorite, but I think the contest is the most perfect in the sense that it's maybe one of the only times all four are kind of on the same track, and we know that. It's not like that brings it together in a weird way at the end that we know they're all in the contest, but they each have individual storylines, but then they still have a surprise at the end with the Virgin and JFK Jr. So it's just like a perfectly constructed little episode.
But it's not just Junior, it's Junior. John F. Kennedy Jr.
I always think of
genius.
Her performance in that episode.
Stunning.
It's
amazing.
So good. And I think that after that, like that was one, and then more of a, this isn't sex stuff, but like just in terms of like edginess or darkness, I know another big turning point for them was the Junior Mint episode.
Yes, another brilliant episode. Yeah.
When Jerry says, let's go watch them slice this fat bastard up. And he's talked about this. And I think if you rewatch that episode, you can see on his face, because he knows he's not that good an actor and he doesn't always hide what he's thinking in the moment as the person. You can see him like go like, I can't believe they're about to let me say this on television, but I'm going to. And after that, they were just like, they knew they could do anything. And this show became so popular that like, the thing is, networks only have something to say about what you're doing until you start making unbelievable amounts of money for them, and then they're like, well,
yeah, all of a sudden it's fine, right? Yeah. Why not? Who said you can't talk about that?
I do really believe that this show, in terms of the sex stuff and sex and dating stuff, it is important to think of what TV was like at that time too, and that we were more in the Cheers and Golden Girls were the leading edge of how like risque you could get. And that you didn't have these kinds of discussions about dating, these sort of ways that they would dissect their dates kind of dispassionately, and the sex stuff. I mean, we've got, you mentioned the spongeworthy, we've got there's a lot of the Lane stuff that's really risque. Like the saxophone player she dates, and his
Right.
mouth is too tired to do other things. And like, there's a lot of stuff that they push the envelope on because of, again, the way that they come up with these cute ways of talking about them, like spongeworthy. And I do think that they, I wrote a book about Sex and the City too, and Sex and the City kind of comes right toward the end of Seinfeld. And I feel like there's a connection there. The ways that the women on Sex and the City sort of dissect their dates and their sex lives together, come up with the phrases. They do the same thing to a large extent. They come up with their own little phrases for, but they're much clearer, like funky spunk or whatever. And, I think that they really take a page from what Seinfeld had been doing. And I often like to imagine Elaine hanging out with the Sex and the City women. I think they'd get along.
It's interesting. So there's a point where the show starts to do incredibly well, as you just said. That was at a point in my life where my parents were actually, I remember on Thursday nights, they would screen it, and then they would see if it was something that they could let me watch as a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old boy, especially with them. They might not have cared if I watched it on my own, but not with them. So what is happening in TV, and as this show gets more and more popular, how much power does it take on in the moment, in those mid 90s, 95, 96, 97?
I mean, it's just beyond anything. So one of the ways I explain it is, often when I do interviews about this book, people say things to me like, oh, are you a big Seinfeld fan? And the way I always answer is like, I grew up in the 90s. Like, I don't even know. I feel like I can't claim like, oh yeah, I'm the biggest Seinfeld fan, because it's like, you didn't make that choice in the 90s. If you watched television, you watched Seinfeld. Like, that's just, it wasn't, I know there are exceptions, and believe me, people love to tell me they are the one person who is so incredibly special that they didn't watch Seinfeld. But, it really was such a force of nature. And we still had also mass culture at that time in a way that we may never have quite again.
Yeah.
There were only a limited number of networks that were really making, television. It wasn't like now where it's like everybody makes original programming. There were really only, let's go with five options or so in prime time. And you would choose one. And most of the time, especially NBC in the 90s on Thursday night, that's what everybody watched. There were these shows in between Seinfeld and Friends that got things like 40 million viewers a week because, and they were awful. And no one's like going to write a book about the single guy, but it got more viewers than like our Super Bowls get now. That's not quite right. But it was, really up there in a way that we're just never going to see again. And so you would like, what you would do in the 90s is you had to watch Seinfeld on Thursday night, because otherwise you were going to go to school or work or whatever on Friday, and everybody was going to be saying some nonsense that you weren't going to understand. They were all going to be running around saying no soup for you or something.
Right.
And if you didn't watch the night before, you were out of luck. And so you just watched it. And that was just the way it was. And it became so huge as it went on. And I really think also, I talk about this in the book, it's one of the first toward those last few years, it like becomes this, you start to see the way we're gonna watch TV in the 2000s and beyond from the way that Seinfeld was starting to be discussed and treated. So like it was really only things like newspaper stories at the time, but there were like the New York newspapers would be running daily, weekly polls. Is it better or worse than last year? Is this one better or worse than last week? When the finale came up, it was pandemonium. I mean, this was just like, they had paparazzi coming over the walls at the studio to try to get a glimpse of what might happen. This was the first time we started to see the internet talk a little bit about, on message boards and things, and everybody was speculating about what might happen on the finale. Like, this was not done before. Like, shows used to just sort of like get
They would
canceled.
end.
Yeah, they just ended.
Yeah.
And often very unceremoniously. Sometimes they wouldn't know. Sometimes they would end a season, and then over the summer they'd get canceled, and they'd be like, all right, well, I guess that's that. And this was one of the first, I mean, we had others. There were things like the MASH finale or whatever throughout history. But like, this was not, now we do this with every show. I feel like every week there's some new show. Somebody's like, everyone's freaking out on the internet about their finale. But this was just a really unusual situation, and they were making insane amounts of money for NBC. Like, there's all kinds of crazy statistics about how basically like NBC was able to buy the Olympics for the foreseeable future, mainly because of the Seinfeld money, things like that. Like, it was really, it could do anything it wanted. I mean, it was just Seinfeld and Friends were like it in the 90s.
The show does change at the end of season 7. The show does change after Larry David leaves. Does it show that Larry had the magic formula? And it's not that those episodes afterwards weren't funny. It's just that they were a little bit more gimmicky. They went a little bit further in what they let the characters do that would have been outside reality. You know, the Bizarro Jerry, they meet people who are just like them. I don't know, off the top of my head, you know, Elaine has a guy working in her at the magazine, or a J. Peterman, I guess, that is dressed in army fatigues all the time. They just go a little bit further in what they let the characters kind of explore. So was it Larry that had the magic formula, and why was it so much tougher for them to write the same kinds of episodes they had written in the first 7 seasons?
I think we can all acknowledge that Larry David is just a genius. And so no one will be insulted if we say that, you know, he invented the show, and he had a darkness too that I think they lost in those last few seasons. And that can be, you know, you might think that's good or bad, but the way I always explain it, and I did not realize this till I wrote this book. Sometimes you know, because you don't take the time to like lay out the exact timeline of how things happened until you're doing something like this. It wasn't until I was writing this that I realized that his final episode is when Susan George's fiance dies.
Yeah.
To me, I mean, that's a pretty big mic drop moment. He's like, I remember watching that and being a little like, oh, I don't know how I feel right now. Like, I felt weird watching it. It was so dark. It was just like this episode where a kind of main character's fiance dies, and everybody shrugs and like goes for coffee. And kind of acknowledges that they're happy she's dead. Like, it's a little bleak.
And George had been trying to get out of this for weeks.
I mean, to be honest, it's an actually brilliant and hilarious
it's incredible
setup.
Yeah.
Like, to say like, what if you really wanted to get out of your wedding and your fiance then died? It would be really awkward, and that is the point. But to me, that's so indicative, because they did have to sort of dig out of that a little when they came back the next season, and they did. He had the foundation and things like that. But, you know, after that, like you said, what I think happened, I always think of it as more cartoonish. It's like you can almost literally imagine it being animated at times, the way that it gets so big, the show. There's the Frogger.
I was just thinking of the Frogger.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of like silly things that, like you said, are kind of gimmicky. And, you know, Larry's rule had been, he wanted the writers to come in with pitches that at least started with something that had really happened to them. And his reasoning was, then they can go crazy. They can do all their little Seinfeld things to kind of go like, what, to me, I think they're always thinking, what is the worst that could happen? Like, marine biologist is a great example. You lie about your profession to a date. You know, what's the worst that could happen? Well, someone could call for a marine biologist, you know? Right. And that is what made it feel like it was connected to you. And so, yeah, there's this feeling later. I mean, I also think of Merv Griffin's show episode, really funny, kind of nuts though. And it's not like you watch that and then went like, oh, this relates so strongly to something that happened to me in my own real life. Like, no, it
never would have happened in the first 7 seasons.
No, I think that was what he was going for, sort of a little more of a philosophical bent that maybe they lost. And one thing they said to me when I was interviewing people about this is that the writing staff of the last 2 seasons, by the way, chock full of people who have gone on to do unbelievable things, like Dave Mandel, who was a showrunner at Veep for the last few seasons. Like, they've done unbelievable stuff, but they were pretty young when they came to the show. And it's kind of wild to think, but it basically was a batch of people who had grown up watching the show and then got hired to write it. So, they were young, and they also were more like fans as much as as writers of the show. So it's almost like part of it is what if you gave a show to the fans and said, like, it's like them playing with dolls about their show or something. That's the best way I can explain it, is like they were just doing stuff that they were like, wouldn't it be funny if Kramer had a talk show, you know, or whatever.
And then they get to do it. Right.
And they get to do it, and they're not wrong. And it's enjoyable. And some of the best episodes, you know, we still got the Soup Nazi and the Elaine dance and things like that in those last 2 seasons, but some crazy stuff too.
Sometimes, and this is like the serious question. Sometimes I see a moment on Seinfeld that makes me wince by today's standards. It's sexist or racist or anti-LGBT just for a moment. They make jokes about people who are overweight. I'll give you some quick examples. Hispanics in the show always had an accent and are not, or sort of an overdone accent and not accepted by the group. They're always on the outside. Jerry and George say there's nothing wrong with that, which was advanced for its time, but now you don't even have to say that.
Right.
Elaine dates every guy she meets until there's a black marathon runner staying in her house with her. Does the show, even though it's still funny, hold up culturally still?
I think it mostly does. But there are definitely those moments, but literally everything made before like 5 to 10 years ago, I think I've had this now because we're all watching so much and we're just like digging deep into the archives to watch old things. I've watched things this year that I'm like, Bridget Jones's Diary, which I loved and always, you know, then I watch again. I'm like, is this an entire movie about Me Too? Like it's just like everything that happened that,
and there's sex. There is a lot of sex harassment on that show too, between the bosses and the underlings.
That's true.
All the time.
And I mean, my God, that's one thing that I feel like in almost everything that happened before, when you watch stuff now, you're like, no, you can't do that at work. So yeah, I think it does generally hold up. I think it definitely has its moments that make us wince, like everything. And especially because there is there's a streak in this show and in Larry and Jerry that wants to push on those issues a little. And at times that means they go too far in the wrong. I think of the Cigar Store Indian as a really good example.
Yeah, that was really not great
and not even that funny. It's like one thing. There's an element where like you can, if you hit the exact right thing, you know, place on this kind of spectrum, it can be very funny, right? If you can get the exact right way. I mean, what I would say about, not that there's anything wrong with that, is that the reason that still kind of works and actually won a GLAAD award in its day.
Yeah.
Crazy, I know, but it's because the joke is not about the gay people. The joke is about how stupid Larry and Jerry are. So I think when they err on the side of making fun of themselves, it works. It's when they go, I think fat jokes are a great example. And this is rampant in stuff from that time too. Watch Friends, my God. Friends is a cringeworthy nightmare from start to finish in terms of the stuff. They do so many gay jokes and they do so many fat jokes. But I think at times, they were trying to, you know, they're at their best when they're basically making fun of, I would say, liberal kind of city dweller hypocrisy is essentially what they're making fun of. And not that there's anything wrong with that. Like they know what they're supposed to say, but they're also kind of uncomfortable. But then there are other times when, you know, it's a little weird.
The question that I always wonder about as I watch these episodes again and again, and I know what's coming and I've seen them all 1,000 times. And I know what I can probably just look at one screenshot from an episode and know what episode it is. Is there a part of us that wishes for that world? No real responsibilities. I have close friends. We can sort of burn the world down around us and not worry about it. Is there something really deep inside of us that longs to live in Seinfeld?
I think so. I really do. I mean, I've had so many people tell me that they can't go to sleep at night without watching a rerun of Seinfeld one way or another, whether they record them, you know, on TBS or whatever, or watch them on streaming now. And it's funny. It comes up a lot as a question to me because it's like not your typical comforting show, like a Friends. You can sort of see, sure, why wouldn't you want to live with a bunch of beautiful people in an unrealistic New York City where you can always get a seat at the coffee shop, but Seinfeld's a little different, right? It's like not warm and fuzzy, but people do find comfort in it. And I think it is so much of its time in a sense in this way. Like for a certain kind of person, the 90s were pretty comfortable. For people like the people in Seinfeld, it wasn't like now. It's not like where this would not work now. You can't make this show now because you'd be like, why are these idiots not, like, they never talk about politics. They're not concerned about the state of the world. They're not trying to help make things better. They are only interested in themselves. But it was a very 90s feeling. And like you said, having this one group of friends, very few cares as far as I can discern, endless people to date. They don't have social media and cell phones to bug them all the time. And they can just sort of like hang, it's a hangout comedy. And I think hangout comedies are inherently appealing even more so right now.
Top 5 episodes. Can I give you mine?
Yeah, do it.
Okay. Now, you did mention one that maybe I would swap out, but I'm not sure which one I'd swap it out for. But let me give you the 5. I'll go just no particular order. The Marine Biologist, The Switch, which is where we learn Kramer's first name and where Jerry and George come up with this plan for Jerry to switch switch girlfriends who are both roommates. The Opposite, where George goes through and lives his life completely differently from his instinct. And there's one point where he goes instinct and Kramer gets to go on Regis and Kathy Lee. The Boyfriend, because they brought the real Keith Hernandez into their fake world, and the fake world is also part of the real world. Great episode. And then I would say The Contest, but I might swap out the Junior Mint for The Contest.
Yeah, Junior Mint's definitely up there for me. Spongeworthy and kind of the Elaine type episode. I'm just like partial to Elaine in a general sense. Like I can remember actually really feeling like I don't know if I could have loved the show as much. I'm so glad they brought her in because she's a national treasure, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and B, having that woman in there as a sort of like touch point for women watching was really critical. Made it better too when they sort of like, I don't know, the way they were about Jerry's girlfriends and stuff. It made it sort of a little bit okay that they at least had Elaine around. And I'm trying to think of any others that I would throw in there. I mean, I do sort of love Soup Nazi. It sort of feels almost pointless to say in a way. It's so classic, but it is a perfect Seinfeldian situation that came later. That was one of the later ones. And that feels ripe for Seinfeld. Something that we didn't talk about, but I think another hallmark of Seinfeld is I think it's really good at New York life. And one of the biggest things it's good about is obviously it's not even shot here in New York. So it's not that, we know it's fake, but they get some of the New York life stuff right. And that's Soup Nazi. It's like there's certain characters throughout the show that do this where it's like, this is very New York. The New York shopkeepers get to make the rules. That's how it works, especially if they have something you really want.
The line for the cookie dough, I remember.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The line for the cookie,
so like they do it even very early on. There's a very early, it might even be the first. It's one of the first episodes where there's some stuff that goes on at the laundromat.
Yeah. First or second.
Yeah. And that's they do it
totally New York. Yeah.
Like even the library book to some extent, it's not exactly a New York thing, but it's like this idea that there are certain people in your sort of, I don't know what you'd call that, like service people in your world who can have so much power over you that, or the car reservation, they took the reservation, but they did not hold the reservation is something that I kept talking about this summer because Zipcar did this like 3 times to us this summer. They said we had a reservation and then they were like, nope, you don't. So it comes back all the time.
We've spent a lot of time talking about Seinfeldia, but I do want to have you talk about your new book. It's coming out in a few months. Your new book is called When Women Invented Television. It's your 8th book. Tell us about that.
Yes. It is about the time period between 1948 and 1955 when TV was not terribly profitable yet, or I should say at all profitable yet, and they were still figuring everything out. And it turns out to be that women did way more than we really have known they did or have been told about before, because when things aren't profitable yet. Often the men don't want to be there. The white men don't want to be there yet. And they were still off running radio, happy to make their money because that was the big thing then. So a lot of women and people of color kind of saw the opportunity pretty early and pioneered a lot of the forms that would ultimately become things like sitcoms and variety shows and stuff like that, and kind of then got dropped out of history. So the way that I explain it is it's basically like a Hidden Figures for early television.
Jennifer Armstrong, author of Seinfeldia, how a show about nothing changed everything. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Certainly check out that book and also the book we just mentioned, When Women Invented Television, and also her Twitter profile at JMK Armstrong, and also her website, jenniferkarmstrong.com. I also want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, a show about something, a show about nothing, no, a show about plenty of stuff. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.